Jambo Radio. We discuss all things Christian related. We talk about questions around the Bible, topics that maybe we don't always get to hear about from the pulpit in churches, and especially in African and Caribbean context, and just basically any questions you might have about Christianity. That's the chat with Exploring Faith with Inonge. We've covered so many different topics so far, and you can always check those out on Overflow Chat. That is my blog. We have a very exciting topic today. We are talking about something that I'm passionate about, and my guest is also passionate about, and that is sport, and thinking about sport and faith, and in particular, how we integrate the Christian faith with sport. But before we get into all of that, just wanted to let you know about all the different ways that you can engage with this topic, ask your questions, messages, contributions. You can do that as always by sending us a WhatsApp message on 0745 990 6822. That is 0745 990 6822. And if you are on social media, you can message us on Facebook. We are Jambo Radio Scotland. On Twitter, we are Jambo Radio 1. And on Instagram, we are Jambo Radio Scotland. And you can also send us an email at info@jamboradio.co.uk. And if you haven't already, please follow Overflow Chat on Instagram and Facebook as well. And you can also send any messages, questions to overflowchat.com. And if you haven't already done so yet, you can now download our mobile Jambo Radio app, and that's available in the App Store for those of you on iPhone or iOS devices. So, I'm pleased to introduce our guest on Exploring Faith on Jambo Radio today. His name is Yamika Banda, fellow Zambian Northern Irish. I don't know how you're going to introduce yourself, Yamika, but welcome to Jambo Radio and welcome to Exploring Faith.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you all.
Thanks, Yamika. I'll do a brief intro. I feel like this part it's best when you're just introducing yourself, isn't it? But let me just give a little snapshot of your life, just in a summary for our listeners there. So Yamika was raised in Northern Ireland by Zambian parents. I actually say Northern Ireland with I feel like a twang, like a Northern Irish twang there. I'm already doing that. And he is a former rugby player who is now turned rugby coach. He is a husband. He is a father, and loves teaching. He's a teacher of business and economics and serves as a housemaster in Cheltenham. That's in England, if you don't know where that is. And he is passionate about all things sport and enjoys following Ulster rugby team and also a game of golf every now and again. So is that you in a nutshell? Have I summarized?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. And a pretty simple creature. So those things make me happy.
Amazing. Sometimes the simple things give us the greatest joys, don't they? And we'll be talking about some of those simple joys in relation to sport a bit later on. But Yamika, maybe it'll be helpful just to provide context to this conversation. If you could tell us a little bit more about your background, in particular, like your current involvement with sport, and I guess maybe your journey with regards to sports to where you are now, because you started off obviously playing rugby and then you moved into coaching. So tell us a little bit about your background, the sports background, and what that journey has been like for you as a sports person, but also as a Christian.
So as you've touched upon already, growing up in Northern Ireland, sport was a big part of my life. For as long as I remember, any ball I could get my hands on, I would be doing that with my siblings at home. Played the whole way through school. Probably played a number of different sports, but it was probably in rugby that I excelled the most. So end of primary school, start of secondary school age, got pretty involved in rugby, took that quite seriously, and so it was doing quite well rugby wise. And then it got to the point where I had, post university, I had been playing rugby, good standard, enjoying it. But then my teaching became my priority because I got a job in a boarding school. And I don't know how much you know about boarding schools, but that for me meant that Saturdays were out of the equation because I was working Saturdays. So we have Saturday lessons. So you'd be teaching in the morning, and then you'd have your fixtures in terms of the coaching in the afternoon. So since that point, so that's sort of 12, 13 years ago now, I have been then focusing a lot on my coaching, and that's given me some really, really fantastic memories and moments. Being involved in coaching first 15 at school, involved club rugby as well. So it's been a fantastic sort of transition. I would say probably forced upon me just because of my job situation, not necessarily because of my age. If I'd had my way, I would have loved to keep playing rugby, but the nature of the beast was that I was not able to do that because of my job commitments. So that was obviously like a bittersweet thing, as you can imagine. Someone that had been really, really involved, really invested in sport, club rugby, university, and so on and so forth. That was a big part of my identity. And so making that transition, was quite difficult. But I always found that then the coaching was the kind of next best thing. It's never quite the same. You're not part of the team as such, but being involved in that environment, having that competitive buzz on a weekly basis, I've really enjoyed that. And I think as well as that, in terms of my kind of pastoral heart, as it were, being able to then maybe impart some wisdom into younger people, not just from a kind of technical perspective, but maybe from a life perspective. People that aspiring rugby players like I was at one point, how to deal with various situations, the challenges that come with that, especially then from a Christian perspective as well. So having that insight, having lived that experience, I found that's been quite helpful then in trying to impart some of that knowledge and the bit of wisdom that I've gained over the years onto younger people.
That's really helpful context, Yamika. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the themes that you've brought out there. I guess the challenges of the nature of sport and how involving it is, and the difficulties of transitioning from different stages of life, as well as some identity. You mentioned their identity, like that's I think that's a big one. I think many listeners who maybe love sport and have transitioned through different stages of life might relate to what you've said there, just about sometimes life just happens and you can't play sport to the standard that you maybe did before, or you don't have time to invest in training and things like that. I play hockey, but I actually picked up the sport almost accidentally because I decided I was going to do PE in school. I moved from Zambia to Scotland when I was 14, and my experience boarding school in Zambia, my boarding school experience in Zambia was very much academic focused. So no chance would they have been like, you can do PE as a subject that you take seriously. It was like sciences, maths, like you need to get those grades. So I moved to Scotland and they were like, here are your options, art, PE, or I was like, what? Like I can do this as a subject? Really, really buzzing. So yeah, I got to learn hockey and played through uni, got a really bad injury, tore my ACL, was out for about a year, got involved in football chaplaincy during that time because I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. So my friend made a suggestion to get involved in football chaplaincy, which, again, a different perspective of another area of sport, women's football, which was really exciting. Did that for 3 seasons, tried to go back to hockey, just didn't have time, thought I was going to just stop, was miserable. So this season I'm back. So just transitions and some of the challenges, but also opportunities that we'll maybe get to chat to a little bit later. I want us to start with maybe thinking about worldviews. And before we do that, just if you're listening to this, we would love to hear your feedback. Are you somebody that's passionate about sport? Maybe you were and you thought it's not something that you could do and marry up with your Christian faith. Maybe you can relate to some of the challenges that we've mentioned about identity or, having the time to be able to do it well. Would love to hear from you. So remember, you can send us a message on YouTube Live, on Facebook, and you can also send us a WhatsApp or voice note. So please do let us know what your experience as a Christian has been with sport and how you marry those things together. Our number is 0745 990 6822. So just thinking about, we're going to be thinking about worldview then. I think it's important to understand why we do what we do as Christians, because if we don't, then somebody may be making an argument or telling us we shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z might convince us if we're not really sure about why we're doing what we're doing. So how do you think your own kind of like theology of sport, as it were, has developed as you have grown in your faith? Is that something that was always kind of there? You mentioned playing from when you were young. Is that something that was always there, or did that develop? Where did that come from? And how would you understand how Christianity, the Bible, Jesus, shapes how you do play sport or coach sport?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. I think from a young age, as I said, I was so invested in sport, and if I was being really honest, I don't think the two things ever married up. You tend to compartmentalize the different aspects of your life. So church was church for Sunday, sport was what I did most of the time, and the two never crossed over. And so I wouldn't have said I had an understanding or a theology of sport until much later on in life. I think it wasn't until I was first involved with Christians in sport, and so obviously a Christian charity who are invested in spreading the good news of Jesus through sport as a medium, that I was able to kind of hear that for the first time. And I think for me, that was actually quite transformative as a young person, because for a long time I always found that conflict in identity is quite hard to manage. Because the school I went to, we were very fortunate in that we had a very robust kind of Christian Union group that would have met every week. But because of my training schedule and regime and so on, I never could go to the Christian Union. And even to the extent, I remember going at one point, maybe had a fixture that was cancelled, and people were like, "Why are you here? Why are you at Christian Union? You're not a Christian." And the assumption was that you couldn't be both. Because if you were a Christian, then why would you miss Christian Union to go and play sport? And that conflict that I had for a long time, it's really hard to get my head around. So I always felt quite alienated in that, because I felt quite isolated in that I was a Christian at that point, and I was very much trying to live for God, but at the same time I wanted to be a professional rugby player. And those two things were quite difficult to marry up, because when I was at rugby, that wasn't necessarily seen as a Christian environment. There were other Christians in the team. I don't know if you know much about Northern Irish context, but there were, quite a few Christians. That wasn't unusual, but none of us talked about our faith in that context. We would talk about faith at church and youth group and so on, but there never would be a crossover between what we would live like when we were at rugby. And that's not necessarily saying that we did anything that was overtly wrong, but it's just there was never an understanding that we were there to represent God in that sphere. And as I said, that came much later on. So I think that understanding for me and the eye-opening moment was just realizing actually that the way you're wired is by God's good design. You are made this way to love sport, and through that you can honor God. And that for me was really, really life-changing, and I don't take that lightly. I don't mean that to sound quite trite, but genuinely for me it was really, really transformative in how I viewed the world and how I viewed myself, because for the first time that really computed, because I felt for so long that I was so obsessed, for want of a better word, with sport. But sometimes you feel guilty for that, because it would be taken away from other things, academics like you've alluded to, or even my faith. And so actually being able to realize that I was born that way for a reason, I was made that way, and I could reflect God's glory through that, and that was a massive moment for me in my life.
The phrase that you mentioned, Christians in sport, which as you were speaking, I was like, that's similar to what brought that realization of like, oh wow, I can worship God through sport. It's a phrase born to play, and it's this idea that some people are just competitive in that sport. So like, they love sport. You mentioned about like, you could just pick up any ball, like whatever shape it was, and make some kind of competition with it. And I would, relate, I think, to that experience, and probably anybody listening to this who has any interest in sport probably can, where, you're really competitive and you're like, is this wrong? Should I feel bad for wanting to win? And I went to a Christians in sport camp, Sports Plus. I was actually just looking for a camp for myself, because I was like, I need to do something in the summer, and then I was too old to go as a young person, so I went as a trainee leader, and it was like a theology of sport. I think the passage I remember in particular was Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, from Romans. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice. This is your true and proper worship. And I've always, understood worship as the singing that you do in church. That's worship. But actually, all of life can be worship. You can worship God through your sport. You can worship God through different activities, because worship is about bringing our whole selves to God in a way that brings glory to Him, in a way that says, you are amazing. And actually, when you look at sport, and it's a summer of sport. We've got Olympics coming up. Zambia women qualified, by the way. Just thought I would say that. Like, we made it to the Olympics. We don't talk about the men's team, but the women's team made it. So, but just seeing amazing things in the Olympics, or Wimbledon, or the Euros are on just now. And sometimes you see just amazing skill, and you're just like, wow, that was amazing. It's like that points, that moment of joy, that moment of elation, that moment of wow, points to the God who is wow. He's a creative God. He gave us sport, and He gave us good things to enjoy. And it's interesting you mentioned, Yamika, just about some of the things that people might be concerned about, which we will talk about in the second half of the show, about it being a distraction and maybe identity issues and some of the culture in sports culture that might be harmful to our Christian faith. But that's a Genesis 3. Well, Genesis 1, God makes everything good. Genesis 3, we see that sin distorts the good things that God made. So, sport in and of itself is not a bad thing, but we can make it a bad thing with our sin and our sinful nature. But that doesn't mean we can't redeem it and use it for God's glory. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, can I be a Christian and love sport? I think Yamika and I, we would say yes, absolutely, you can, and it is possible. I want to just finish before the break on some of the barriers. We've touched on some of them. What do you think some of the barriers are, for Christian sports people? And maybe in particular, Yamika, from African backgrounds. Some of these will apply to both, but I'm thinking in particular of maybe for Christian people from African backgrounds, because a lot of our audience would be the diaspora. When it comes to sport, we've talked about all these amazing theology of how we can worship God in sport and what an amazing opportunity it is. But what would be some of the barriers for somebody being involved in sport in a meaningful way, or in a way that we've just talked about?
Yeah, I think obviously everyone will have different experiences in terms of your upbringing, but I think certainly from my experience, I would have felt a lot of the time that my sporting ability wasn't appreciated by my family, because it's kind of seen as a hobby. It's not something that you do seriously, and so therefore, playing at a competitive level, I wouldn't necessarily have had the support that other peers would have had, in terms of parents on the sidelines, driving to training sessions. A lot of that had to be self-driven. I had to be quite intrinsically motivated to access opportunity, I guess. And I think we've touched upon this already, but I think that's primarily from a perspective of it can be a distraction which takes away from your bread and butter, which is your academics. So therefore, if you're playing sport and you're doing well at that, then there's always something in the back of your parents' mind that means that you're not working as hard as you could be. So why would you do a training session in the morning before school? Because that's going to make you tired and then you can't do well on your test. That kind of mentality, that was always the kind of prevailing thought in our household, where I know I remember I laugh about it now with my brother, where when I was at school, so in the equivalent, third year, I didn't know what that would be in Scotland, but I had been called up to play for the year above in the Medallion Shield, which is the cup competition, which is quite a big deal in Northern Ireland. But my parents had no idea whatsoever. And it happened that my dad was coming to pick me up and just happened to stumble across the match that we were playing in. He had no idea I was playing, what the context was. And my coach actually said to him, your son's pretty talented. And my dad had no idea. It was never on his radar. And I think my mum watched me play rugby once, over probably 20 years. And it was that sort of thing where the initial barrier was just that initial buy-in from family, and just to appreciate what that was a gift, as opposed to just a kind of pastime that was a distraction. And I think in addition to that as well, even from a perspective of, we've obviously heard a lot about Eric Liddell recently with the anniversary of Paris, but that kind of mindset of, playing sport on a Sunday, A lot of the opportunities that would come, in terms of representative rugby would be on a Sunday, for instance. So
Mm-hmm.
you'd have your fixture on a Saturday for school, and then if you were then called up to the next level, a lot of that would be on a Sunday. And even that as a barrier, that would never have been entertained in our household. It was just a no-no. It
Yeah.
wasn't even a discussion. And so that sort of barrier, and as a young person, that can be quite damaging because the opportunities are limited as it is, in a very competitive field, and so therefore, when you're missing sessions here and there, that you can be frowned upon and often dismissed without a second chance. And that was quite lost on my parents and our family situation. So I think those are kind of two barriers I would look back on that have had an impact on my understanding, my ability potentially to progress in certain areas as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, I think that is a big one, isn't it? Just the family context and the buy-in. And I guess just looking at it from the other perspective, I mentioned earlier that moving from Zambia to Scotland, and moving from a context where education was your way out of poverty. So I guess for some people, the African community is very broad, so people have different experiences. But I'm particularly thinking of maybe a family that has migrated for a better way of life, basically. To them, at least in most places in Zambia, at the time, I think things are changing now, but at the time it was like education is your way out of poverty. And when you're in survival mode, you almost don't have time to think of pleasures or joys. So we're talking about how these are God's good gifts to be enjoyed. It's like when you're surviving, you don't have time to think about what you could enjoy and all the good things, because you're just trying to meet your basic needs, like who's paying the bills, where's the food coming from. Like I lost my dad at 14, and my mom was a single mom just trying to feed like 4 kids. So in that context, and I think it might be helpful if you're somebody trying to minister to somebody from that community and you're trying to help them think through, just be conscious of that, and to have some compassion by the fact that actually it's a privilege to be able to think about just playing sport and enjoying that. Like, that is a privilege a lot of people in the world don't have, because they're trying to survive. And so I think it took a long time for me to come out of survival mode. I had to do a lot of unthinking, like, it's fine. You can enjoy things, you can smile. It doesn't mean you're sinning or you're letting anybody down. Like, I had to come out of a hustle culture mindset, as it were. And so part of that might be just that challenge, that just being able to think in a different way, just because of maybe what you've been through or your experiences. And I think that's where the Christian worldview helps, because if you're thinking about sport as more than just a nice hobby that helps your well-being, and you've got this bigger, broader perspective of, this is worship. The Lord can use this to shape me, to shape my life, to bring glory to his name, to minister to other people, then that can help to shift those perspectives. And so, yeah, just helpful things to think through. Not that we have easy solutions. I think these dynamics will probably always be there. But yeah, maybe for Christian parents listening to this, or youth leaders or pastors, it's just helpful to, when you understand why people might behave in certain ways because of their life and how their life has shaped them and the challenges they've been through, it helps you not be like, oh, for goodness sake, why don't you just get over it? Why don't you get it? And that compassion can help bridge that gap, I think. Is there anything else that comes to mind, Yamika, just in terms of other barriers for Christian sports people? You mentioned the Sunday one, which is a big one, an interesting one.
I guess, like, off the top of my head, I think like a slightly more nuanced one is the kind of perception that people have of rugby players, especially. The big drink culture, quite macho environment. So that in and of itself is probably quite a particular thing to me in the rugby context, because the perception would be often that if you're in a rugby environment, that's going to be unhealthy, and that's going to pull you away from your faith. So that's a kind of like a subsidiary barrier, but barrier nonetheless, where people would often, even in church, not even just at home, there would be a perception of, oh gosh, if you're playing rugby, then that's really dangerous. We need to kind of protect you from that, as opposed to, as you've said, viewing that as an opportunity to go and serve God in that environment, and even potentially witness to people in that environment who'd have no other access to church or the message of the gospel. And so that was quite unique, just trying to get people to understand that actually, if you are equipped adequately to go into that environment with the right mindset, that can be a really powerful thing. as opposed to hiding away from that and then potentially not having any Christian influence in those spheres. And that was something that even till this day is still a challenge that I have. And when I'm speaking to parents, when you speak to people, the automatic instinctive response is, "Oh gosh, rugby at university. I don't want my child playing in that," because of the kind of the anecdotes that you hear from various people. But it's just trying to, it's just change that narrative somewhat and see that actually it can be a bad place, as you've said, because it's obviously tainted with sin, as everything is. But it can be redeemed, and it can be a beautiful thing if you have the right mindset and if you're equipped in the right way.
Yeah. And that's a big one, isn't it? Instead of thinking, right, let's get you out, how can we think about equipping people? Like, if you recognize dangers, what does it look like to equip young people to be, what does it mean to be a Christian in that sport? What are the unique challenges, and what does Jesus have to say? Because if we believe that Jesus truly is Lord and he really does transform and sanctify us, we shouldn't be afraid of going to places that we think, oh, because Jesus wouldn't do that. He wouldn't, there's no space or area that Jesus would be like, nah, we're not going there. That's too much. That's too, he would be right front and center. So what would it look like to ask for his help and think about how we might equip each other to not just survive, but thrive in those spaces, in rugby, football, and all these other team sports that people might be like, ooh. Good chat, Yamika. I'm going to take a music break, so just for our listeners to take a little breather. We've covered a lot of ground, so I'm just gonna play an amazing song by Phil Wickham called Living Hope. That was Phil Wickham with Living Hope. What a tune. Welcome back to Exploring Faith with me, your host, Inonge Siluka, here on Jambo Radio. We are talking about faith and sport, just having a really good conversation about what it looks like to integrate the Christian faith within our sport, and having a theology of sport that is all-encompassing, helping us to see that we truly can actually live for Jesus and worship through our sport. I'm with my guest, Yamika Banda. We were chatting in the first half a little bit about what are some of the barriers that we might have, or Christians might have, especially from African communities, to properly engage with the world of sport. And so if you would like to join in this conversation, what are some of the barriers that you have noticed in your own life, or people that you know who play sport, who you know are Christians? What are some of the solutions that you propose, or some helpful contributions that you might say to that person to encourage them in that area? Please let us know. We would love to hear from you. Join in the conversation. You can send a WhatsApp message or voice note on 0745 990 6822. And remember, we are on social media, so you can send us a message on Facebook on Jambo at Jambo Radio Scotland, on Twitter at Jambo Radio 1, and Instagram jamboradio.scotland. Yamika, welcome back. We're back, continuing the chat.
We're good to go.
Yeah. I wanted to do a continuation of some of the barriers and maybe make them specific to maybe some of the concerns. So different groups of people might have concerns. I actually think some of them come from the same place, but maybe we can think of or share one or two concerns that a parent of a young sports person might have, and then we're gonna think of maybe young adults. Are we young adults? I don't know, what age does young adults stop from? I'm not gonna answer that.
I am.
Young adults, I think I'm past that stage. That's students maybe. In your 20s, you're a young adult, right?
That's unfortunately not me.
Yeah, I'm past that. Okay, young adults, which is not us, but people who are young and in their 20s, and then maybe a young sports person. So a youth, somebody, still going through those challenges and learning, as it were. So let's maybe start with parents. Some concerns that parents may have. You mentioned some of them. Just they love their children. It's not coming from a place of they want to be sports no parent wants to be a sports sport. You want your best for your children, and so you want to shield them from things that you think are going to cause them harm. What would some concerns be, and how would you respond to the concerns of a parent in that area, engagement with sport?
Yeah, I think from a parental perspective, as a parent myself, I think the biggest fear is that you lose influence over your children, because quite often what happens in that environment within a sports team is that becomes something that really dominates in the headspace of the young person involved. Often, using the university student as an example, you're doing that most days of the week. Weekends you're together, evenings you're together, so that becomes the main voice that you're hearing. The prevailing thoughts that you're hearing can be quite counter what you've been brought up with, perhaps counter Christian a lot of the time these days. And so you can understand from a parental perspective how you want to kind of safeguard your children against these other voices. And I think that's a genuine concern that a lot of people have, and I think it's a valid one.
Yeah.
I think what I would say to try and combat that somewhat is, as we've alluded to beforehand, I think there's only so much that you can protect your children. I think there's an element where you can't go down the route of saying, right, absolutely no contact with these other people. But that doesn't tend to be realistic. And I think what often happens then is when you are exposed to these situations, then you're not prepared for it. And that actually has a greater detrimental impact on you as an individual. Whereas if you view that as an opportunity to go into a place where there might not be any other voices, and use that as an opportunity to be well read, to be knowledgeable about how to interact in those environments, that can actually be a really powerful thing. And I think the key thing that I would suggest is that I think when you're looking at these scenarios, as daunting as they may be, I think it's a wonderful thing and quite a liberating thing to realise that you are able to honour God in that space. And going back to what you were saying about being born to play, if God's given you those gifts, that could be the way that He wants you to minister to the people that are in your sphere of influence. And if you change your mindset towards that, that's actually quite a powerful thing when you think about that. That you might be the person that's uniquely gifted in a particular way to reach that group of people. And I think when you see that fear and turn it into an opportunity, that can be a great thing. But I would say, you can't be quite naive about these things. And I think that from my perspective, the key to that is how you are prepared to go into those environments. Not taking things for granted, not thinking that you're above fallen, but actually being really humble in your approach and relying very much on God and good people around you, and to equip you adequately to go into those spaces and to be able to do an effective job.
Yeah, preparation is key, isn't it? Being able to be equipped. Just disclaimer that neither Yamika and I work for Christians in Sport. We have mentioned Christians in Sport a few times. That's because, I guess, as you've heard, we've both found the resources there genuinely helpful in being able to think through the nitty-gritty of some of these challenges. There's a podcast, there's a website with loads of resources. There's resources specific to game day, devotionals, like so much stuff. So I would definitely recommend that just to help you through, and just networking with other Christians. Sometimes you think you're the only one. You think as a parent you're the only one going through some of the challenges that you're going through, and Sunday sport and all these things. But there will be other the parents going through the same thing, parents who've maybe gone through that and their kids are now grown up and they can come alongside. And so I think community within the church, within the sports Christian community is helpful as well. And there's opportunity to join different networks just to get that support, because as you say, Jamika, you in as much as we want to say like this is a good thing, this is a great opportunity, we can't be naive about how difficult it can be, and so we want to make sure that we are equipped in those spaces. Young adults, so this would be I guess mostly applied to students really, and university. What would you alluded to something actually, with the many competing interests, like you've got church and then there's sport and then there's Christian Union. I was involved in Christian Union, and if you've got, I don't know if you have that in Northern Ireland, but Bucks Wednesday, like that's when you big game day. And then you probably would have training on a Monday or Tuesday night, depending on what level of sport you're playing, 2 or 3 times a week. So you can't always go to things like Christian Union meetings and things like that, which makes it look like, well, you're not passionate about evangelism then, if you're not coming to this meeting. So what
Yeah.
would you say to that person that is wrestling with that, and they want to do mission and do all these things and be involved, and they've got this sport that they love, and they feel like,
Yeah, I would say it's about priorities. I think, what is a fact is that it's really hard to juggle. And not a lot of us are good at that. It tends to be that if you're sport minded and inclined to love sport, that can become a priority. And I mentioned this earlier on. I think a big part of that is understanding who you are in Christ.
yeah,
You're not defined by your sporting ability or your sporting achievements. And so, therefore, actually, sometimes the most appropriate thing would be maybe not to do every single thing that you have to do with sport, if you're permitted to do that. It's obviously, as you've said, different levels and so on, the demands might be slightly different. I think it's having an understanding of who you are, and I think it's trying to take away that kind of legalistic view of what's right and what's wrong, because that might look different for different people. And I've even found that in my context where you've got someone in the same team and they have a different approach to the way you do things.
yeah,
And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think we all have to be accountable to the Lord ultimately, and what that looks like might be really, really different. But I think it's just having an understanding of what your priorities are. And I always come back to the fact that when you're going out into the world, I think if you're not in a good place, personally, then that's going to lead to trouble. And so I think, in terms of the kind of rigid, you have to do this in terms of church, good to see you on this day, I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to that school of thought. But I think the key thing is as long as you're doing that at some point,
yeah,
and I think like church, I think it's really important to gather with God's people. I think that's one of the God's give us, biggest blessings to us as believers is that body that we have, the body of Christ, that we can share experiences with, people that can keep you accountable, that can call you up and encourage you to follow. So I think it's really important to prioritize that. But I think what I would say is you could be a bit more flexible on what that might look like. Might not necessarily be able to go to every youth group on a Sunday evening because you're away on a fixture, but you might have to then think about how you're creatively going to do that during the week, for
yeah,
example. Maybe even finding one other person in your team that you can get together and pray with and read God's word. I think there are many different formats of that you can use to do the same thing. And so I think one thing that I found quite liberating was just maybe taking away that legalism and making it less rigid. You're not less of a Christian because you've not been to youth group on a Sunday. And I think sometimes that's quite a big pressure that people feel, because sometimes whether that's said explicitly or not, sometimes that is the impression that you get because I've missed church on a Sunday morning, then I'm the worst Christian ever, and that can be rather discouraging. But I would say, it doesn't have to be that rigid. I think it's really important to think about how you as an individual can get the same wealth of support, of fellowship, and so on, and maybe in a slightly different way. And I'm not very second advocating missing church, but I just do appreciate that for some people, it becomes quite a sort of fixed binary thing. You go to church or you do other things. I don't think it's as clear cut as that. I think that sometimes it can be rather complex, and so it's just
yeah,
trying to find a way to make it through in those situations. And I always find in life as well, it's seasons as well. It's not always going to be like that.
yeah.
It's not. Certainly at the minute in my life, it's not the case, and I'm thankful for that. Church is very much what we do on a Sunday. I don't have any competing things, but there have been times in my life where I've had to miss church for various reasons, and it tends to be things that go in seasons and change over time.
Yeah, that is helpful actually. Just thinking about creative ways of we don't we like to do binaries, don't we? It's this or
Mm-hmm.
that, but actually there are ways in which we can make sure we are prioritizing that discipleship and the teaching and the fellowship with God's people, because like you said,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the means of grace that God uses to encourage us, to help us grow as Christians. And yeah, just creating that space. And the fact that you said it changes, it won't always be that way, because I remember when I was a football chaplain, I'd never had to worry about Sunday sport, because at uni Sunday sport was on a Wednesday, and then now it's mostly on a Saturday, and we have occasional Sunday games, but I've made it a rule that I only play in an emergency, and an emergency is we have a good chance of winning the game, and we have 10 players and there's no subs,
Yeah, yeah,
and I'll play if we've got three other subs, or we're gonna it's a team like 5 leagues above, we're gonna lose anyway,
yeah,
then yeah, so
yeah.
that's just something I've created. I don't expect other players to be the same. They might choose to play, but I'm just like, oh, actually no, and they get it, nobody's fussed about it. But yeah, women's football
Yeah,
is on a
you're right.
Sunday.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think I was just going to add to what you're saying. I think that it's important to have your sort of principles. You know what you stand for, what you believe in, and why, and that's really important. And I think then the flexibility off the back of that is where the nuance comes in. So I think you prioritize. You think, is church important? Absolutely. Is that where you get fed? Absolutely. All these things are absolutely true. But I think off the back of that, as you've said, having a sensible policy to play in an emergency, I don't think that's a bad thing. And being, as long as you have a principle, I think that's really useful. So whenever
Yeah.
you're confronted with that situation, you're not left totally clueless as to what to do because you've thought through these different situations. I think quite often that is the problem. We don't necessarily preempt some of these situations or tricky things we might find in our path, and so then you're kind of caught on the back foot and you don't know how to respond. But I
Yeah.
think actually it's going back to that being equipped. Having spoken to someone who's wise, who's perhaps been in your position before, reading some of the resources you've referred to before, Christian support website, other websites, just having an understanding of what things might look like, and having a range of options at your disposal that you can execute as and when. I think that's really, really helpful. So you're not just caught unawares. You can respond in the appropriate way because you've actually thought about a number of different scenarios. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. And I think it's a general principle, helpful principle in the Christian life anyway, like, outside of sport, just thinking through what does it look like to honor Jesus in this context. So every time I start a new job, there will be dynamics specific to that job. I'm sure you see that, in teaching, say you went to another city, or you worked in a more rural area, there'll be dynamics unique to that. And you sort of have to go in and be like, what would it look like? What challenges might I think will come up here? And that will look different when you're 16 when you're 25. I'm 30. I was about to say 34. I'm adding years to my life. I'm 33, but as a 16-year-old, I may have been tempted by people, with telling me to take however many shots of alcohol. At 33, I'm just like, well, no, I'm not doing that. That's the end of that. Like, I'm not, peer pressure is not a thing. Literally, like, I'm unbothered by it. But as a 16-year-old, I might have been like, oh, okay, what do they think of me? And so I might have had to think through, what's it going to look like? Do I maybe just not go to that party or that event or that thing? Whilst now I'm like, oh, actually I can go because I know that that situation is not going to be something that affects me too much. I can just go and have my chill drink, and nobody's questioning me or asking questions because we're past that and we're adults now. So just important point, thinking things through beforehand and thinking through specific contexts, and having community and people to feed off, like, hey, how do you handle that situation? Like, when this happens, how would you deal with it? Just learning in that way.
I think it's that ability to be connected with other people, isn't it? Being in fellowship is such a wonderful thing. And I think, often as a young sports person, quite often I find that you might be one of maybe two or three people in your youth group that are sporty, but it's trying to identify these other people who have similar paths, who are going through similar things. I think that's really helpful because then in that shared experience, you might be able to have some insight into what someone else is talking about. And therefore you might say, actually, I had the exact same thing last week in my school and my team, and this is how I responded. And just having that wealth of knowledge then can be really, really powerful. And just trying to identify these other people who are like-minded, who have the same goals and same passions, and trying to connect with them. I think that's useful.
Yeah, that's helpful. Just to wrap everything up, we're just running out of time slightly. Always run out of time. Just a personal question and maybe some application from that. We've probably touched on it already, but just in summary, why do you continue to be involved in sport, like personally? And then as a follow-up from that, what would you say to somebody who, they've listened to that and they're like, I don't see the value? Like, what would you say to a person like that? So just to
Yeah, I
follow.
think the first one really easy. I absolutely love it, and as I said, I'm born this way, and I'm so delighted because just for me, it's such a reflection of God's creativity. And it's going back to the very beginning in Genesis 1, isn't it? Kind of Imago Dei, God's image. What does that mean? For different people, it means different things. But for me and the way I'm wired, it means that I love sport. I love competing. I love trying to, push myself to my limits. And so, therefore, being involved in that just gives me that buzz that I can rarely find in any other sphere.
Yeah.
And I love that, and I don't apologize for that. And I think being able to reflect God's glory through the gift that He's given me, I think is a wonderful thing. And just those moments when you've had a really close game and you managed to win, wherever it might be.
Yeah.
I think that those moments, I think that's for me that is such a gift from God that I get to experience that, and I get to give it all back to Him for His glory.
Mm.
I think when you take that away, it becomes quite untethered in terms of why you live your life and the purpose that you have. But having that why, that big why, and it's
Yeah.
because God made me this way, I think that's a wonderful thing. So from my
Mm.
perspective, that's an easy answer. I think for anyone who's sort of sitting on the fence of the value of sport, I think that, you know, in a kind of broad sense, some of the values that you gain from being involved in a sports environment, they're very well documented. Things like resilience, things like being able to be part of a team, things like being able to overcome various things. But even from a Christian perspective, I think it's a wonderful thing to be that person in your team that is the kind of bedrock, the person that is going to point people to Christ. And
Yeah.
I'm not 1 second implying that every interaction I've had has been a really good evangelistic opportunity. I wish it was, but that's often not the case. But what I've certainly found to be true over the years is that God puts you in places, and I
Yeah.
think in those places you can have a massive impact. And I think it's that whole adage of you're planting seeds, aren't you, for trees that you'll never ever see.
Yeah.
But even now, I'll have people that I've played with. I had very recently, like maybe 2 weeks ago, I had a chap that I played up with years and years ago, maybe 12 years ago. I haven't spoken to him since. And just in the middle of the night, he had had a really bad situation in terms of his family. Excuse me.
Mm.
And he just reached out and said, really random, but can you please pray for me? Because this
Mm.
is who to turn to. I just remembered you were a Christian, and it was like so random because we weren't that close, and we haven't kept in touch at all. But it's those seeds, isn't it? Those
Yeah.
probably quite innocuous moments where I probably was just being a normal person, having a beer with him in the clubhouse, but being able to then speak into that situation, say, "I will pray for you," and then check up with him, follow that up. I think that's really powerful. So I think for a lot of us, I think being wired the way you are, I think that's very much intentional by God's good design. It's not accident. It's not accidental that you love sport. It's not accidental that you want to be competitive. I think God wants to use that in all of us, and that's not just restricted to sports. That's everything in terms of the array of God's riches and His creativity. But I think
Mm.
wherever your thing is, I think God wants to use that, and it can, and that can be such a powerful thing to be able to walk in the path that God has designed for you and for His glory. So if you're sitting on the fence, I would say just go with it and embrace
Mm.
it, love it, because it's such a fulfilling path to walk.
Amen. Love it.
Mm.
Love it. Um, yeah, I wanted to summarize what you say there. I realized we didn't talk a lot about the mission and the opportunity for
Mm.
mission in detail. But I wanted to summarize that as so three things. Why should I be involved in sport? Why should I let my child be involved in sport?
Mm.
The first, the opportunity for worship.
Mm.
The second, the opportunity for discipleship. And the
Mm.
third, the opportunity for mission. Like
Mm.
worship, being able to enjoy God's good
Mm.
gifts and to be able to be able to worship Him in that way, and honor Him through everything that we do in sport. And the discipleship aspect, actually, like some of the stuff that we've talked about, that's sanctifying stuff. Like God will
Mm.
use everything to make us more like Jesus, including sport.
Mm.
How do you deal with disappointment? How do you deal with injury? How do you deal
Mm.
with bad form or not being as good players you were 10 years ago?
Yeah.
All these things, God is using us to challenge our idols and to sanctify us, make us more like Jesus. So it's an
Mm.
opportunity for discipleship to be in those spaces. And then, like you mentioned there, the opportunity for mission, where we're there. We're the best people. Sports people are the best people to reach sports people. We need to reach that world. That is a mission field. Who's going to reach them? Who's going to go if we don't? And so, yeah. So why do it? Worship, discipleship, mission. I think that's a good place to end. I think we both mentioned Christians in Sport website. I was going to ask Yamika, do you have any other resources that you'd recommend around this topic? Books, websites, or anything else that you would recommend?
Without sounding like a broken record, I just think like the work that Christians in Sport do is absolutely fantastic. I think if you're someone that is feeling a wee bit disconnected in terms of your sports team, your church, you don't know where you fit in, I think get along. If you're a young person, get along to Sports Plus in the summer. It's a week of the summer where you get to get pushed in your sport, challenged to be better and to learn more about who Jesus is and what that means for you in your sport. And I think it's such a great place to go because, as I've said before, you find people who are like-minded, people who have the same passion, and you can connect with those people, and those people can become lifelong friends who can walk
Mm,
alongside you and encourage you and to follow. And I think it's such a great place to start. If you get along, you won't regret it. I would
yeah,
promise you that.
yeah.
And I think that opens up avenues to other different organisations that are doing wonderful work, not just in the UK but across the globe.
Yeah.
But I think I would always say, get along to something like a Sports Plus camp, and get stuck in, and you'll see where that takes you.
Yeah. Yeah. And the website is christiansinsport.org.uk if you're looking for that, and just check out all the different stuff that they have. Yamika, this was a good chat. I enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful for you listeners. Thank you so much for coming on Exploring Faith here on Jambo Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. It was good fun.
All right. So that's us. You can find a recording of this on Jambo Radio's socials, on YouTube, on Facebook, and also on my blog, overflowchat.com. I'm going to leave you with another lovely tune to enjoy the rest of your Saturday. It is He's in the Room by Maverick City. Bye.